All right, welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a few minutes. We're watching participants enter into the Zoom webinar. So once I see those numbers slow down ticking up, we'll go ahead and get our seminar started. Give people just maybe another 2 minutes or so to get signed on. Okay. We're getting there. Still see the ticker increasing slightly. Okay, well, I think this is a good point for me to welcome everyone and just do a brief introduction to our seminar tonight. My name is Alfie Vick. I'm the director of the Environmental Ethics Certificate Program here at the University of Georgia. And I want to thank everyone for attending this Environmental Ethics Seminar. We've been doing these since the beginning of the Environmental Ethics Certificate Program, which was back in 1983. So we've been going for quite some time. Just a little bit about the certificate. It's an interdisciplinary program that prepares students to synthesize ideas from a wide variety of perspectives with the intent of solving complex environmental and urban and social issues, both in theory and in practice. It was, as far as I know, the first certificate of its type in the United States, and definitely we're proud to still be going strong after 40 years. Like I said, 1983. So in just a few minutes, I'll put our website in the chat so everyone can know where to find more information about the certificate and about upcoming events, because, like I mentioned, this is a seminar series. And as has been our tradition since the beginning, these seminars are open to the public. There are students who are enrolled in a seminar course who are required to be in attendance, but we always make these more widely available and really enjoy having attendees from outside of the class, but within UGA and certainly beyond as well. So since we're on a Zoom seminar, there will be time for Q&A at the end of the seminar, and I'll be monitoring the Zoom both through the Q&A function and through the chat function to look for questions from anyone in the audience. So please do feel free to ask questions at that point in time. If you want to raise your hand during the question and answer, I think I also have the ability to unmute you if you would rather ask your question verbally, and I'm happy to do that. So I'm excited that tonight we have 5 speakers who will be discussing the importance of including youth in the planning and design of our cities and strategies for doing so. All 5 are contributors to the Routledge Handbook of Design for Public Spaces, Routledge Handbook of Designing Public Spaces for Young People, Process, Practices, and Policies for Youth Inclusion. And I'm going to introduce Katherine Melcher, who is faculty here at the College of Environment and Design and one of our panelists, and she'll be moderating the session. And I'll turn it over to her to introduce the other 4 panelists. So Katherine, turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Alfie, and thank you all for being out there in Zoom land. And I'd especially like to thank our 4 guest panelists for coming here today, or virtually being here to share their work and their thoughts with us today. As Alfie said, all 5 of us are contributors to this book that you see on screen, the Handbook for Designing Public Spaces for Young People. 2 of the panelists, Dr. Sarah Little and Dr. Adina Cox, were also co-editors on this project. And the book itself is divided into 3 sections. The first section is about why. So why do we need to include youth in the creation of outdoor spaces? The second section is about how, so more strategies and techniques for engaging youth in outdoor spaces. And then the final 3rd section is a collection of case studies of successful projects. And all 5 of us here today contributed to that first chapter about why. So why should we engage young people in public spaces? And so that's why I thought that this would be a good group of people to come here and talk to the environmental ethics seminar. So what we're doing today is we're going to talk about why we think that we should be considering more about young people's rights to the city. So we'd like to talk about what specifically do we mean by the rights to the city? So what should youth have access to? What do we mean when we say that they have a right to the city? And then also asking who, like when we're talking about young people, are we considering all young people and all backgrounds? So each panelist has a slightly different perspective and a different case to make, but I think collectively we create a strong argument for young people's rights to the city. So what I'm going to do is introduce the panelists, and then each one of them will give a brief presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So we have Dr. Adina Cox. She teaches in the Landscape Architecture Department at Iowa State University. She holds a BSLA and a Master's in Natural Resources and a PhD in Design from North Carolina State. Her research has examined children's outdoor play environments, including nature play spaces and pathways in urban environments. Dr. Juan Torres is a certified urban planner and professor at the School of Urban Planning and Landscape Architecture at the Faculty of Environmental Design, University of Montreal, Quebec. He holds degrees in architecture, urban planning, and environmental design. And his research and teaching concern urban design, especially with regards to the environmental determinants of mobility and the participation of children and youth in urban planning and design. Dr. Sarah Little is an associate professor of landscape architecture at the University of Oklahoma. She holds an MLA and a PhD in design from both North Carolina State University. As a researcher, she works to understand the influence of the physical environment on human behavior and development, including research on children's autonomous exploration and children living with disabilities. And Dr. Mariela Fernandez is an associate professor in the Department of Recreation, Sport, and Tourism at the University of Illinois. Her research examines the environmental injustices impacting urban communities. And her recent projects explore possible solutions to address limited access to green spaces in Latinx communities while minimizing instances of gentrification and solutions to improve community engagement and representation. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to Adina to start us off. Are you able to share?
Yeah, I think so. Are you seeing it now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katherine. Thank you for inviting me and including me in your environmental ethics webinar. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I suppose if you are all looking at environmental ethics, you've all heard and discussed Aldo Leopold and his land ethic. I think it's really important that we realize this importance of the symbiotic relationship. And I think that's really strong when we talk about our youth. So he talks about the ecologist calls these relations symbioses. So I think I just wanted to stress that point that what is good for youth is also good for the public. I'm going to do a little brief, quick summary of Patsy Eubanks Owens' chapter in the book because she's not here and it sort of leads into my chapter. She talks about children and not only their presence in the built environment, but their ability to participate in the design and planning of the built environment. So she talks about young people need places where they have the freedom to engage in activities that foster their healthy development. And the public realm can provide these opportunities for them to engage in healthy pro-social activities. And participation in the planning and design process helps them build social responsibility. She uses Bronfenbrenner's ecological approach to human behavior, which stresses that the progressive mutual accommodation throughout the life course between an active, growing human being and his or her environment is important. She shares the micro, macro, and exosystem philosophy of this theory. So developmental affordances within a socio-ecological model. So basically showing that these benefits that are provided by children engaging in outdoor public space, not only the use, but the planning and development, it gives them opportunities for self-reflection and internal growth in the individual system. The microsystem, which would be the family, could give them places to manage their free time effectively. The exosystem, such as the school, the neighborhood, is where they learn to experience satisfying social relationships. And then the macro system, when they're involved in these public processes of designing and engaging in the planning for these outdoor public spaces, gives them a place to develop a sense of social responsibility. And this all benefits youth because they're able to build self-esteem and grow internally, develop satisfying social relationships, learn to manage their free time, and build a sense of social responsibility. It benefits the public because a successful transition of youth to adulthood has long-term positive implications for society. Places where they feel safe and welcome contribute to them becoming caring citizens. Involving youth in decisions about their life and their communities contributes to their healthy development. And participation in community activities as youth helps them develop this pro-social identity and leads to lifelong community engagement, which we know benefits the community when the public is involved. So I'm going to move on to my chapter, which is Freedom to Flourish. And it looks a lot at children being engaged in being able to use the environment for their own personal growth, how it benefits them. I'm going to talk about specifically independent mobility, healthy social development, executive functioning skills, pro-environmental stewardship, and beneficial risk. So independent mobility is not a child walking by themselves, as you might think. It's the child experiencing the environment without an adult. And this is really important for a lot of reasons, partially because children spend some time after school alone or without their parent or caregivers present. Their ability or license to move about the environment gives them the opportunities to have more time spent outdoors and perhaps more time spent with friends. All of this supports their cognitive, social, physical, and emotional skill development. In the picture that I have that I skipped through too quickly there, you see these kids are experiencing independent mobility. They're with their friends, going to music lessons after class. A child could be with a dog. Some parents feel safer when their kids have their pet or their friends with them. And so it doesn't have to necessarily be alone, but basically with another being is still independent mobility. This helps them develop autonomy and self-reliance. There is a positive relationship between parental support for autonomy and children's mental and physical health. So if they're learning slowly to experience the environment by themselves, they develop these skills and end up being mentally and physically more healthy by having this time outside. The public realm can help children develop healthy social skills as well. We have bonding and attachment, which happens peer-to-peer, youth to adult, youth to family, or youth to community. So this bonding and attachment gives them a sense of security, comfort in stressful situations, guidance and support in decision-making, physiological regulation for physical health, and long-term mental and physical health benefits. The NIHCM Foundation talks about mental health and mental illness. So we know that it's not only compounded by this lack of a community involvement or the ability to be out in the community, but also COVID has impacted it as well. So it's when it's prevalent in young people, it may persist throughout their lifetime. We know it's rising faster in this young adult population, and nearly 1 in 3 teens ages 13 to 18 now has an anxiety disorder. We also know that their suicide rates are skyrocketing for these young adults and teens as well. So the opportunities to be outside also help youth with their executive functioning skills. The more time children spend in less structured activities, such as playing, reading, engaging with their friends, the better their executive functioning skills become. So these executive functioning skills relate to decision making and making good decisions for themselves and for the public. We know that when a person has better executive functioning skills, they result in better health and wealth and social outcomes in adulthood. And these executive functioning skills develop clear into young adulthood. They don't stop at 18 or 12 or anything younger. They keep developing through their young adulthood. We also, when we want to talk about pro-environmental behavior, we're looking at behaviors that are going to support us in the upcoming or existing biodiversity and climate crises. And a deeper connection to nature may partially explain the engagement in pro-environmental behavior. And we also know that connection to nature may require long-term or repeated exposure to nature. So having students go outside on a field trip in 4th grade isn't really enough to develop that pro-environmental behavior. We need the sustained and reoccurring opportunities for kids to experience the natural world, which is hard to do in their yards and homes. We also know that risk is healthy for children. So there's a non-associative theory of risk in psychology that children develop fears of certain stimuli that protect them from dangerous situations. So it's good to be afraid of a cliff or a snake if you're a young child and you don't know how to handle those situations. But when you successfully make these risks, you get this kind of positive emotional exuberation. And then once you develop these coping skills, you're less afraid, your fear goes down, and you master the skills that you need to face those fears or those risks again. We know that there's an increased neuroticism or psychopathology in societies if risk is avoided. We know that when children are more protected, once they are released into the wild public, they face higher risk if they haven't learned to experience these risks in smaller steps. Ellen Sandsetter talks about these different categories of risk: great heights, high speed, using harmful tools, facing dangerous elements like cliffs or rivers, rough and tumble play where children can disappear or get lost. And obviously you need a bigger public environment for youth to be able to experience these risks, learn to, navigate, experience these, and cope with all of these experiences. It's also important to know that risk is not the same as hazard. These risks are healthy challenges that youth face and can face in the public environment. I just wanted to end with a note about the symbiosis. If you look at anything in environmental ecology, and also it works the same with children and the public, it's this ability to help one another. If we help our youth engage in positive activities in the public environment, then they will become better leaders in the future. So it's really important for society down the road to allow children these opportunities for healthy development, which they gain from being present in the public environment. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Adina. And now we will move on to Juan.
Hi, thank you. And thank you very, very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here reflecting under this perspective of ethics. First of all, I come from Mexico and I work in French, so my English is a little bit rusty, but it should work. And thank you for your indulgence on that. But as I was saying, I'm really interested in this perspective, the perspective of ethics, the perspective that as professionals is really important because it challenges our receipts, the way we learn to do things, and the judgment we have about what it's supposed to be good or not, especially when shaping the city, when shaping public spaces. I'm glad also to present after Adina, because her very interesting presentation gives us a very nice and global framework. I'm going to focus more precisely on the streets. And well, why streets? Why I thought it was interesting to focus on streets? Well, first of all, because of their quantitative meaning. In cities, we can estimate that about half of the footprint of our urban environments are made of open spaces. And from that half, 2/3 are made of streets. So we can estimate roughly that at least 1/3 of the space of the surface of our cities are streets. And we are not always sure that we have access to streets, or we are not always sure we are not always confident about letting our children being alone, experimenting independent mobility, as Adina was presenting earlier, by themselves. But beyond this quantitative importance, streets are also qualitatively key on our experience of the city, or experience of our community, or experience of ourselves and our development. Of course, streets are determinant in having access to different resources in the city: parks, schools, our friends' houses, our best places for meeting other people. And well, this combination of qualitative and quantitative importance makes streets a very key part of our daily environment. But at the same time, streets are under huge pressure. And the last century, or I should say 110 or 120 years, well, streets have seen a multiplication, a diversification of the uses of this space. Of course, with the new motorized vehicles that arrived, especially mainly during the beginning of the last century. And more recently, we're all different kind of vehicles, but a lot of pressure for motorized mobility. And well, this pressure also results from, which is very curious, relative diminution, a relative decreasing in the proportion of the land in cities dedicated to streets. An interesting study made by UN Habitat shown that during the last century and up until now, if we see, especially in suburban areas, the amount of land devoted to streets, it's actually decreasing. So we have each time more car dependency, or at least motorized mobility dependency, and at the same time, fewer square meters, fewer square feet for using the streets, especially for these activities, for this mobility. So facing this problem, again, the question we can ask ourselves: what should we do? What is good to do? as professional in urban planning and urban design, in landscape architecture or whatever profession that has to see with shaping the cities, what is the good thing to do? There's where I think the ethic question rises with a lot of complexity, because it's not easy to find the answer. Well, one of the answers we have found up to now, and that was not new when Le Corbusier codified it at the Charles d'Athènes during the 30s, last century, well, was the solution of separating functions, segregation, separating activities, separating uses. So putting in one part motorized mobility, and in another area pedestrian and cyclists. And well, this solution, this way to understand what is good to do, is still very relevant in our days. We're still having this reflex of separating cyclists and pedestrians, separating the high-speed circulation from low-speed circulations. And that's how actually we imagine our cities and the mobility systems and the streets, the way streets work. We believe that it's important to have sidewalks in order to separate pedestrians from vehicular circulation and so on. And it's an important answer for that challenge of negotiating this cohabitation in the same space, in the streets, of all this diversity of users. But at the same time, and here's when it comes in very interesting from my point of view, at the same time, this reflects, or this way to understand what is good to do, how we should from an ethical basis, shape the city. This answer has also blind spots. One of them, for instance, is that it puts forward, it puts the spot, it puts the light on children and youth vulnerability, on their incapacity to cope by themselves without training, with the risks, with the complexity of this environment of cohabitation. It puts also a lot of light on the hostility of our urban environment. So this combination of perceiving the city and the streets as a hazardous place, and also perceiving children and youth as vulnerable persons in these places, well, fits the apprehension, fits the fears we have as adults about leaving our children or kids by themselves on the streets. So do you see this blind spot and the difficulty to address it? Because, well, what the solution could be? Of course, we have developed during the last 40 years a lot of traffic calming devices, which are very useful. They reduce circulation speed, and we know that speed is and volume of circulation are key determinants of the severity and the number of injuries and pedestrian and car collisions. And it's important to focus and to continue occupying, putting traffic calming devices in our street networks. But again, perhaps it's not enough. Again, the side effect of focusing on security and focusing on the vulnerability of children is, again, this lack of perspective about all the different uses the street could have. By focusing only in traffic calming and the security of this cohabitation, we have the tendency to forget that streets can be the place for many more activities than only circulation. Yes, streets are places where we can meet, where we can play, where we can face risks, we can learn how to cope with risks. Streets are places where we can just be without moving. And we know when we see a group of teenagers, when we see a group of kids playing here in Canada, in Montreal, playing hockey in the streets or improvising goals for playing on the streets, we understand the polyvalency of streets. But again, what is good to do? How can we be sure that we are acting properly as professionals of the city? How can we create spaces that afford for this diversity of uses of the streets that can allow us to diminish the risks? Well, it's not easy, and that's why I think the ethics perspective is so important in addressing this kind of questions. I'm going to finish just by paraphrasing Tamar Shapiro, a philosopher who has a very nice paper. The title of the paper from '99 is "What is a Child?" A very, very enlightening paper. But one thing that I keep from her paper is that our moral duty as adults is not necessarily to protect children, but more to make everything we can in order to make children and youth not needing our protection. So how can we create streets that translate this moral duty, the duty of not only protecting, but beyond this protection, making everything for children and youth not to need our protection? I have no answer. I just wanted to share this question that it's still quite big and bold in my mind when I try to teach urban planning or urban design to students. So I leave it here and thank you very much. I hope I didn't use too many time.
Yeah, thank you. It's very good questions for us to think about. Sorry, 1 second. So, okay. So in my part of the panel, so far we've talked, there's a lot of many rights to the city that are important for young people. There's the right to the streets, there's the right to explore, for mobility, for the right to access nature. I wanted to focus on another right, and it's one that I think is not very frequently acknowledged, and that's the right to build. So the right for young people to make their own places in the public realm. And I like this quote from David Harvey where he says, "The freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is one of the precious yet most neglected of our rights." And in this presentation, I want to make the case that the right to build, so the act of physically adding to the environment, is critically important for young people. And so this argument is supported by research I've been doing into community-built practices, and community-built refers to a practice that involves the local community in both the design and the construction of community places. And a lot of the typical projects are playgrounds, public art, and gathering places. And my research specifically, I looked at people who self-identify with the community-built process, so they're members of this group called the Community-Built Association. And although you could say that almost anything is community-built to a certain extent, the contemporary community-built movement in the United States emerged in the late 1960s and early 1970s with some artists like Bill Walker, who's a muralist in Chicago, Lillian Rosenberg, a mosaic artist in New York City, Bob Leathers, an architect who did playgrounds in Ithaca, New York, and landscape architect Carl Lynn and builder Paul Hogan working in Philadelphia. So some of their premises, a key premise voiced by Lillian Rosenberg, is that children should be encouraged at an early age to participate in the beautification of their own environment. And as Paul Hogan said, "I used to think that I wanted to build playgrounds for people. Then I thought I would build with people. But now I see the far best, though most difficult way is to encourage people to build for themselves." So I wanted to go over 3 main questions about the relationship between young people and community-built processes. The first one is, how does the community-built process lead to self-growth and empowerment. So this relates a lot to Adina's presentation about self-growth and youth. And then why is art important to community-built work? And then finally, why is the physical, permanent, public nature of these projects important? So first of all, these projects present an opportunity for youth to develop knowledge and skills. So they not only build upon their existing skills, but they also discover new and unexpected skills, interests, and strength. These skills include social skills in addition to the technical skills. As one artist reflected, perhaps the most important of all, young people learn through the principles of participatory democracy and civic responsibility, how creating a sense of community takes more than just building with bricks and mortar. And as you can see in this picture, collaboration becomes a physical reality rather than just an abstract idea. So in addition to developing knowledge and skills, the youth engaged in these projects can undergo a change of sense of self and what they can accomplish. So this evolution of self-worth starts with the youth's realization that their ideas and abilities are valued. So as this quote says, including students in the design phase empowers them, shows respect and recognizes them as creative, thoughtful individuals. This affirmation from adults helps to build students' confidence and acknowledges that their contributions are important for shaping the environment. And then often in these projects, the youth are encouraged to share their new knowledge and skills with others, and they develop into community leaders. As this one quote says, mosaic artist, several teenagers became the real tile junkies. Their enthusiasm was high, and I asked them to teach the next newcomers to arrive. Soon the adults were looking to these young people for direction. And as this confidence further grows, it grows further when they see how their contribution impacts the world around them. So instead of seeing themselves as users of the space, they become active creators. As this quote points out, for once the child is acting on his own environment rather than being acted upon. So by developing skills and having their contributions valued, they experience themselves as producers rather than solely as consumers. They experience, perhaps for the first time, their own power to change the world. And this, I believe, can have profound impact on how they see themselves in relation to the world. So then my second point is that art is an important element in the community-built projects. So art engages people and draws them into a project. And additionally, visual arts can enable the youth to communicate thoughts and feelings that aren't so easily expressed in words. And the art forms of community-built projects, which are often murals and mosaics, lend themselves well to integrating multiple individual voices and expressions. So then the artwork becomes this visual expression of how one's idea fits into a broader community vision. Therefore, through these artworks, the youth can see their individual thoughts and ideas valued, but they also see how it fits into a community as a whole. So as said in this quote, the project allows the child to grow, to be valued, and to define himself or herself as a member of the community. So finally, I'd like to point out why the physical and the permanent and the public nature of these projects is so important. So the physical nature of these projects makes both the individual contributions and the collective collaborative process visible and tangible, so that at the end they have something to point to with pride and say, we did this, or I did this. And then the permanent nature, several community-built practitioners also point out that this permanent nature of the work is important. And as this quote says, the permanence proves to both children and adults that the work is fully, not conditionally, accepted. And finally, the public nature of the projects is also important for the youth. As this quote says, it places them in a role of responsibility to the community. So through a public project, the youth who often feel dismissed by society can begin to see how they can positively contribute to the public realm and the public discourse. So to conclude, what I hope I have shown you briefly is that engaging young people with the building of public spaces encourages a sense of self-growth and empowerment. It also models collaborative decision-making and improves the youth connection to the broader community. The use of art and the fact that the projects are relatively permanent and public are important to the impact these projects have on the young people involved. But I will also say that not all places in the city need to be youth built or even community built. But I do think that there should be more awareness of the value of these practices and places. And I think there should be more thought to how youth built projects can be incorporated into larger city building initiatives. So thank you. I guess we'll move on to Sarah.
Share my screen here. So thanks, Katherine. Thank you guys so much. My name is Sarah Little. I'm acting director and associate professor of landscape architecture at the University of Oklahoma. It's so exciting to hear from my colleagues and to be able to share my work with you today. You know, when we're talking about the right to the young people's right to the city, I think we need to talk about how some people experience the city. And so I'll be talking to you about young people living with disabilities and the importance of focusing on experiential accessibility. There we go. So this work started in 2017. I was hired by a local nonprofit to create a design for an accessible nature play and learning area to be installed in Oklahoma City. And the nonprofit really wanted me to focus on young people living with autism spectrum disorder, mobility limitations, and vision and hearing impairments. And so from this process, I learned a tremendous amount. But before we dig into that, I want to take a step back and look at accessibility in the US. And really, when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, that was signed into law in 1990. So this act was passed by Congress, signed into law by, I think, President Bush at the time. It basically includes 5 titles, and for design professionals, it's titles 2 and 3 that are most relevant. So Title II really pertains to public entities, governments of all levels, and then Title III is really looking at private entities who own or operate places of public accommodation. And so there's a lot of language looking at making sure people have equal access to services, programs, or activities, or goods, services, facilities, privileges, et cetera. And you know, within each of these different dimensions, there's this kind of duality, right? There's this physical accessibility, but then there's also the experiential accessibility. So when we're talking about laws, a lot of it is depending upon who is doing the interpretation. And so we see whoever's interpreting the law really determines the focus, whether it's on physical accessibility or experiential accessibility. So in the United States, laws are interpreted through the US branches of government. So here the ADA was passed by the legislative branch, signed it into law by the executive branch. And since that time, it's been interpreted through the judicial branch or the court systems. And historically, what we've seen, a lot of ADA lawsuits are being filed on behalf of individuals living with mobility limitations. So these are individuals who getting from point A to point B is difficult, right? If there are steps in the way, rely on a wheelchair, you know, that becomes prohibitive. And so that's kind of these mobility limitation lawsuits have really focused how ADA is interpreted. And so we see that there's a lot of emphasis on physical accessibility, but that is really starting to change. Because when you look at the ADA lawsuits that are they're coming to court, more and more are addressing individuals living with autism. And so, you know, mobility limitations may not be part of their experience, being able to experience the benefits of the goods, the services, programs, it's more than just a mobility barrier that people living with autism have to deal with. And so we see that the more that these lawsuits are coming about, they're changing, or I would say expanding the focus of ADA to also consider experiential accessibility. Vendors have a huge impact on how ADA is interpreted. So as a landscape architect, if I'm designing the playground and I'm specifying play equipment, it's nice that the vendor's done the work for me, right? And they've created a piece of play equipment with ramps and elevated tables. And so I can specify their equipment and I can say my project is accessible. But for design professionals, the ADA, there's a standard for accessible design that we use in order to make sure our places that we're creating are accessible. So I want to take a look at this example of a swing to illustrate this point between physical and experiential accessibility. So this is at a public park owned and operated by a local municipality. So it does fall within the purview of ADA, and we have to make sure it's accessible. So as far as physical accessibility, it's doing well, right? It's got the piece of play equipment, it's got the ramp. A young person in a wheelchair can easily get into the swing and experience that vestibular stimulation that we get from swinging. It's that wooey feeling that you get from rocking back and forth. And so it does provide some sense of experiential accessibility, but I would argue that it's very limited. In my experience as a young person swinging, it was very much a social experience. You would swing with your friends to see who could swing higher. I'm a child of the 80s. And so at that time, John Anderson had a really popular song called Swinging. And so my friends and I, we would swing on the playground at recess and sing this song to each other. And so, this, for me, swinging is very much a social experience. And in this example, any potential for social interaction has been completely designed out of the environment. So here, you've got this singular swing, it's isolated with this barrier of this fencing, it's completely segregated from other areas of the playground. Any sort of social interaction between someone sitting has been designed out, right? The bench is on the opposite side of the fence, it's pointing in the opposite direction. And then just the icing on the cake here is this sign, restricted area, wheelchair users only. And you have to even go track down a key that even uses swing. And so I'm not saying that this is done on purpose, right? But definitely the social experience has been designed out of this playground. And so when I was reflecting upon my own work, designing this accessible nature playground in Oklahoma City, I really wanted to do better. And I thought that in order to really consider experiential accessibility, I had to start to understand the experience of young people living with autism spectrum disorder, mobility limitations, and vision and hearing impairments. Now, of course, the ultimate disclaimer is that the experience of disability isn't universal. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. And so, I had to do the best that I could. And so I explored the literature. I looked at various blogs. I read medical articles. I conducted a focus group with people living with disabilities, advocates for people living with disabilities, and parents of children living with disabilities to try to understand what their experience was like. And as I began to fill out this matrix, two things kind of came to the surface for me. One is that in previous readings I had done, it seemed like nature had a positive impact for each of these experiences that these young people were having. And then the second thing that kind of came to the surface is that, there's this potential that across these disabilities, there may be common experiences, potentially, having issues with processing sensory information and experiencing barriers to social interaction may be common experiences of children living with disabilities. Certainly the swing supports the barriers to social interaction. And so I thought that if I address these two experiences in the design of this accessible nature playground, that perhaps I could increase the potential for experiential accessibility. And so through this exercise, I came up with 3 environmental interventions to help facilitate social interaction and sensory processing. So the first one is escape spaces. And we see this a lot with children with autism spectrum disorder. They can become overstimulated with just very minimal sensory information. So if they're in a playground, there's a lot of activity going on. If they become overstimulated, they can become aggressive and aggravated. And so by having these little spaces where they can go and kind of isolate themselves from sensory information, kind of calm down and reset, that perhaps this could help them re-engage in social interaction. So these are just very like basic spaces surrounded with shrubs. And I think the key here with these escape spaces is that children of all abilities could enjoy these spaces on the playground. The next one is providing transitions between play experiences. So particularly for children with autism spectrum disorder, this is a way to kind of slowly release information to them, right? So that they don't become overloaded with sensory information. Using vegetation to surround play settings could also keep play elements within that setting, which could potentially make it easier for a child with like a vision impairment to navigate. And also providing like these transitions between pathways and like lawn with this brick border, you know, this provides an edge for like a child with a vision impairment that's using a cane to navigate. That provides an edge for that cane to catch on. And then lastly, looking at 3D models to represent suggested activities to facilitate social interaction. So if you're born with a vision impairment and you've never seen a stick fort, like how would you know what that is? Right. So by having these modest models within play environments, it could help children understand the activities that are happening. Also, if a child has limited upper body strength, like having these models could help them direct the activity of other children. Or even children living with autism spectrum disorder, sometimes they're very literal thinkers and like having these type of creative projects can become a barrier to them. So having a model that they can base their construction on could definitely help them be a part of the activity. So one thing with each chapter in the first 2 sections, the why and how sections of the book, there were takeaways. And so the QR code, the black one will take you to a Google Drive that contains all the takeaways for all the chapters in case you're interested in learning more. And then the red QR code just takes you to my personal website if you want to learn more about the work that I'm doing.
Great, thank you. Now we have Mariela, our last presentation.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Mariela Fernandez. I'm at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. The chapter title that you will find in the book was Racially and Ethnically Marginalized Youth as Stakeholders of Outdoor Public Environments. I will say that I'll be using the term youth of color for simplicity's sake. Also, as you heard during the introduction, most of my work is related to green space. So I will be talking about outdoor natural environment. But in case you were interested in the title, I wanted to include it. But for today, what I have planned is kind of give you the rationale for why youth of color should be included as stakeholders. I'll talk about the purpose of the session. And because of time, we can't go over all sets of recommendations. So I'll go over 3 for you, and then I'll finalize with a discussion and conclusion. So across North America, youth of color confront many challenges in visiting outdoor natural spaces. So this includes your park spaces, your trails, and your open space. So youth of color, particularly those that live in low-income communities, for example, they might be affected by neighborhood violence and neglected infrastructure, which makes visits to outdoor natural spaces unlikely or more difficult. Additionally, youth of color lack adequate access to outdoor natural spaces. So what we're finding is sometimes these spaces are just completely not present. At other times, these spaces are present, but they have neglected infrastructure, are overcrowded, or just not safe. And now, we definitely want to promote the creation of new outdoor natural spaces, but what we are finding is that when we create new park spaces, for example, sorry, I'm hearing an echo. Hopefully no one else can. But I was saying, as like the creation of new park spaces, what that is leading to is gentrification. So youth of color, instead of being able to enjoy these spaces, they are displaced to other neighborhoods, which again may or may not have access to these spaces. And we can't forget that youth of color who do go and recreate in outdoor natural spaces, they are subject to racial profiling, as the case is here in the US and Canada. So if we think about it, given the ways in which youth of color are affected, they definitely represent a stakeholder group who should be incorporated into the planning and design of these spaces. I will also say that my team and I advocate for an environmental justice approach. So this means that communities involving youth should focus on maximizing distributional, procedural, and interactional justice. So if you're not familiar with this, distributional justice related to this topic is making sure that youth of color have equitable access to outdoor natural spaces. Regarding procedural justice, this means that they need to be included and prioritized in the planning process. So this aligns with the principles of the Children's Bill of Rights, which advocates for the youth participation in policies that directly affect them. And for this, it means including youth of color either in researching their own communities or neighborhoods, maybe carrying out planning activities, and definitely making recommendations that could address some of the neighborhood challenges that are affecting them. And without the participation of youth of color, what may happen is that outdoor natural environments may not meet the needs of the youth. Finally, the interactional justice component regards that individuals, in this case youth of color, should perceive outdoor natural spaces as places where they can engage with others in a safe, respectful, equal, and just manner. So with that in mind, I do recognize that including youth of color, well, youth in general is not easy, but youth of color present other challenges, especially given some of the disconnect and distrust that youth of color may have toward different community institutions and officials. This includes planners, park officials, and so forth. So again, because of time, I want to focus on 3 recommendations that I want to leave you with if you are interested in involving youth of color in the process. The first one is racial equity and justice training. I did find a couple of training modules online, so I picked one that kind of aligned with this. So the Race Forward has some training modules. So this is their components, which I thought were applicable. So I think for organizations wanting to include youth of color, one of the first things that organizations need to think about is, what does racial justice even mean for this particular community? And what does it mean for the youth of color in this particular neighborhood? Additionally, people who are engaging youth of color may not be people of color. So the second component that I encourage is having adequate training and on what structural racism is and how that impacts the neighborhoods. So in the case of the US, a lot of residential segregation has put people of color in neighborhoods that lack adequate access to outdoor natural spaces. And so individuals who are engaging youth of color need to be aware of this history and also need to be comfortable with talking about it in public forums. The other thing that I definitely recommend for those interested in this work is having implicit bias training. And there are a lot of different components of bias training, but the one I wanted to focus on for this particular session is that implicit bias are sometimes impacts our subtle behavior toward people. So with youth of color, this might be inviting them to our community forums. And if we have biases against them, we might not smile at them, we might not make them feel welcome, we might avoid eye contact, and we might just generally be uncomfortable. So as a person of color, I can definitely say that we definitely notice when that happens. So of course, if your individuals and organizations are trying to encourage youth of color to be at these community forums, then it's definitely important for staff to have awareness of how to catch their biases before they manifest in behavior. And again, kind of like one of our other panelists said, I know that opportunities for youth to be involved are not possible across the board. So communities really need to be intentional and really think about what opportunities can youth engage in and provide meaningful feedback. The other thing I wanted to mention is also the importance of the social justice youth development framework. So again, those individuals, whether they're planners or park officials, city officials, engaging youth of color need to be comfortable enough to talk about power relations in the community and also things like racial, structural racism. So in my work, I found that individuals, particularly white folks, are not very comfortable talking about these items. So in some cases, they feel like I have not had any life experiences with this, so I can't talk about it. But in most cases, in communities of color, these are conversations that a lot of us have very early on. So middle school, high school, a lot of us need to know how to engage in these conversations. And folks working with youth of color need to feel comfortable in doing so. Additionally, the other thing I wanted to bring up is the making identity central. So you notice at the beginning, I talked about all the challenges that youth of color may be facing. And so unfortunately, if we focus too much on the challenges, people start feeling like, you know, the feelings of despair, oppression, marginalization, that everything is so negative. But with making identity central, that is encouraging youth of color to also identify the assets in their neighborhood. So what is it that they like? And also letting them show pride for what elements of their neighborhood they really do like and what they want to keep. But with the social justice youth development framework, it's about acknowledging the assets and opportunities for growth, but also identifying those challenges and empowering youth of color to engage in collective action. So collective action will look differently depending on the neighborhood. So it can be something as the individual action. Maybe youth are feeling traumatized or sad about the neighborhoods in which they live in. So it might be about empowering them to get help. Or it might be about identifying neighborhood conditions that need to change in outdoor natural spaces and giving them the training and the tools to know how to navigate that process. I know even as adults, a lot of us don't know what to do if we want to advocate for a new park or a bench in a park. So youth also need some training. So that's where that component comes in. And the last one is embraces youth culture. So this one is related to my next point. Oops. About the need to formalize processes to ensure the inclusion of youth of color. So it's really easy when we say, oh, I'm going to include them. You may or may not. But when you form a policy that says you have to include them, then it's easier to go ahead and pay attention to your own policy. So by formalizing processes, I mean things like creating youth councils, right, for youth of color. If that's not possible, right, soliciting feedback at out of school time programs located in neighborhoods with residents of color, or soliciting feedback at schools with youth of color. So there are different ways of engaging youth to make sure that they're included. And finally, my 10 minutes are probably up. So I just want to say that including youth of color has many benefits, not just for themselves, but also for the community at large. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and leave it up for our Q&A.
Thank you very much. So as you can see, we've got, it's not a simple question about young people and their rights to the city. It's very complex depending on just very many different perspectives.
Yeah, thank you all. That was really great. And I see that we already have one question that has come up in the Q&A, and so I'll go ahead and read that out for everyone to, if I'm not sure if everyone can see that, but Carly Rickles asks, oops, now it just got moved to the end. For all of you, have you come across methods or case studies for inviting and engaging youth into community forums? Do we think about community engagement differently in order to cater to a younger population?
So I see that Juan is typing an answer, but I don't mind tackling this unless you want to answer it, Juan.
Yeah, I have just shared a quick reference from a handbook that I think could be useful for Carly. But I would just like to say that in my experience with my colleagues here in Montreal, the processes that we have set up and conducted, the participatory processes, I have seen how, for instance, municipalities or our stakeholders are afraid of these processes because they seem huge, complicated, delicate, and all the things that make it hazardous for them and for their traditional way of doing. And they usually get surprised about how simple this could be. And well, just mention one experience we had, just being in the places where the youth were, just being there, present, and having the time for this presence to become less artificial and more honest, and presenting the goals of the process, the reasons why, for instance, this municipal process want to be open for children and youth, and making it interesting for people of different ages, genders, and interests. Well, all these are like advices for making it appealing and trying to reach youth. It's not easy, and one good thing to do also is to get alliances with the local organizations who are used or who are in daily contact with children and youth. Schools are some of these organizations, but usually more inclined to ally with community organizations or organizations that are more diversified in the population they work with. I will stop there. But there are a lot of references that can be really useful. I used to find a lot of nice examples that are very inspiring, and I think that's the nice part of this job, is to try to design these kind of activities that are appealing for everybody.
So at the University of Oklahoma, we're a graduate-only program, and we're reworking our final project to be a final studio, a community engagement studio. And so from that experience, what I have found, trying to do community engagement within a year is to tap into the existing networks that exist. And so I think, not to peddle the book here, but in our participation and practice section, the third section, it really goes into really successful examples of youth participation. And kind of the common thread among all of those is that, people were able to connect to organizations already on the ground that are engaged with youth so that you're not having to build those networks. I think that's definitely a secret to success. The other, in the how section of the book, the second section, there are a lot of really good participation methods that you could use. And again, the QR code that I provided for the takeaways, all of those are included in the book. But, I would always look at, when we're talking about engaging youth in these processes, looking at Roger Hart's work, The Ladder of Participation, because he makes a really good example of, in order for youth participation to be successful, they have to have agency, to influence the direction of the project. And I think that is the key takeaway here is that they actually have to have authority to guide the progress of the project.
I would just like to quickly add that we do have the good examples in the book, and one that stands out to me, and one issue that you have frequently with youth groups, and probably also with racial and ethnically marginalized and populations that are lower SES, is that a lot of people don't have time, and it's inconvenient to come to these community forums and spend the time when you're already sacrificing a lot for your jobs and your lives, especially families. And one of our chapters talks about supplying food at these meetings. And that simple act brings families the ability to attend when they have these really busy days and you have pizza for them. Just those kinds of activities, thinking about what life is like for families and people maybe that have more challenges in their day-to-day existence. So I just wanted to add that component.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, Carly, you really set us up good to advocate for the book. So definitely wonderful examples. I will say for traditional community engagement, especially for communities of color, I get a little bit frustrated when I go into communities and I still hear, well, people have the opportunity to tell us what they want. They can send us a letter or go through our website. And like that just doesn't work for communities of color. And in fact, in my chapter, we talked about, because of that type of attitude and process, that's kind of where the nonprofit sector stood in, right? So there was an organization I was working with in Chicago, focused on environmental justice, but they were able to kind of encourage youth to speak out during, by getting them in the school districts. And once the youth became involved, they're like, this is actually pretty cool. And then the organization also allowed families to come. So they had a different role for parents, grandparents, and youth. So it was more of an intergenerational approach to community engagement. And I will say, sometimes people of color may not attend community forums, not just because of the busyness of their lives, but it's because of the past way that cities have either disregarded their opinions or haven't really done anything with them. So I think that is also that, it needs to be said. If you are encouraging people to come out at these forums, you have to be very clear what you can and can't do with their feedback.
Okay, if there are any other questions, feel free, any of our attendees, to either type them in, or if you, like I said, if you raise your hand down at the bottom of your screen, I can see that and I can unmute you if I see you raise your hand. But I have a question. A couple of you touched on this, I think, when talking about some of the goals of, kind of the independence and designing places where parents don't feel like they need to be protective. And I guess my question is, are there any specific strategies to help overcome some of the fear that parents might have in letting go, in kind of providing that agency to their children to have some more independence and participation in this kind of thing?
From a built environment standpoint, I think that parents often feel unsafe when there's a busy street. So some of the things that Juan talked about, like traffic calming measures, do help. I know that dense vegetation can sometimes concern parents. So if we have an environment where there is some transparency, kind of what Jane Jacobs talked about, eyes on the street, things like that. The book talks about these neighborhoods. One example where they had an after school, it was a foreign country, maybe it might have been the UK, but they basically invited senior citizens to come out and get safety vests and watch children as they walked to and from school. So they kind of had like this kind of pseudo responsibility of being the street safety crew, all volunteer. So I think part of it is a little bit of a catch-22 when you have a child and there aren't any other children out on the street. That's a signal to you that it may not be safe. The more kids, the more people that are out, the more safe it feels. And so from the built environment perspective, there's that. And I think from probably a programming perspective, there are opportunities just for education and encouragement. There's like bike radios, a day where everybody, or the day where everyone rides their bikes or walks to school as part of the walking school bus. So there are built environment steps, I think, and programming steps that can encourage that. So
I would like to take on it, and it's a great question, Alfie, because of course, and I live it myself. I have 2 kids, and although I promote for independent mobility, it's hard. And I remember the first time I let my daughter go to the grocery store at the corner, I was looking through the window. It's hard, of course. And I think from a urban planning perspective, distance is a key point of it. Distance enables, or not, the possibility of walking to daily destinations. And there's where traffic calming is not enough, because it's important also to learn with children how to cope with the uncertainty of the streets. And it's important also as adults to learn the skills of the children, of the kids, to realize their capabilities. And walking daily to school, for instance, as Adina was mentioning, with this kind of walking buses, or just walking regularly, walking on a regular basis with children, it's I think the best way for the community to demystify the very simple act of walking on the city, of being on the streets, and to using the streets for attending our daily destination. So I would say distances, and also walking with them, although it could appear like contradictory. Independent mobility is letting the children and youth walking alone or being alone, but to be there, it's important to get there by walking with them first, I think.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I mean, this is a very complex problem. I think there are a lot of built environment interventions that can facilitate independent mobility, kids being on their own. So like in Norman, my husband and I bought a house in an older part of town. So, you know, it has a really nice grid network. It has a nice density. It's very walkable. We can walk to a lot of different destinations without having to cross like major arterials. You know, it's just developed, you know, using like the traditional street hierarchy and nice density. And so we are inclined to do those types of things and to let our children have that type of freedom because we bought a house, you know, that supported this. But it's really a societal phenomenon too. I mean, like you have people calling the cops on parents because their kids are going to a park alone. You know, you have states that have started passing legislation to protect free range parenting. You know, it's kind of out of control, you know, to where you think about an 8-year-old can't walk to a park, you know, unless they're accompanied by adults or the cops are going to get called on you. So, you know, I think we deal with these very complex problems, right? And within our own frame of references, we have our tools that we can use to try to facilitate the situation and make things better. But ultimately, you know, these problems are very complex and not to be like the Debbie Downer, but I mean, it is very much a societal issue as well.
Yes, thank you. Those are great insights. And yeah, very, very complex problem. Absolutely. I don't see any more questions. And I know we're getting right up against our time, which is perfect timing with all of your presentations. So, Katherine, did you have any closing remarks or anything you wanted to say?
No, I just wanted to thank all our panelists for coming here. And I know I have the book and I've read your work before, but I haven't like seen you present in person. So this was nice to get us all together and share these ideas. So
yeah, and I echo that thank you. Thank you all for your time today and congratulations on getting the work completed and published. It's such a huge contribution to you know, to what we all aspire to do in the built environment. So and thank you for the great presentations tonight and taking your time to be with us. I look forward to, you know, hopefully seeing you all in person at future conferences and events in our world.
Thank you for this opportunity. It's been great.
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
Great. And thank you all of our attendees that have been here and the great questions that we got as well. So that I'm seeing lots of thank yous coming in through the chat to your panelists. So
yeah, and if they want the QR code or anything else about the book, yeah, let us know. We'll be happy to, you know, provide that.
absolutely. Yep. So anyone, if you need help getting contact information, you can certainly contact me and I'll help get anyone in touch with you. All right. Thank you very much. I will sign us off until next time.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.